Welcome back to my channel. If you guys are just joining us, please go back and start from part 1 for a couple of reasons. One, you're missing out on so much information from the story. And 2, that's not how you read a book, right? If we were in class, I would have you guys make up the pages that you missed. So please go back to part 1 before we go on any further. Alright, if you are still with me, because you're on this part, we're going to talk about what we read yesterday. So we read a couple of chapters yesterday, like always. We read, let me find it in my book. I think we read What's in a Name and Cha-La-La. What's in a Name was about how the BBLL came up with a plan to hide the books that were in Amy Ann's locker. So they made like new fake names for them and a fake cover for them that will go over the top of it, so that if anybody does have it in the school, that a teacher isn't going to recognize it as one of the banned books. And then the other chapter was about Dave Pilkey's visit, and he came to the school thanks to PTA money, and he was telling, all the 4th graders about his life, and when he knew he was going to become an artist and an author, and then asked if anybody had questions, and Amy Ann raised her hand. And I think it kind of shocked me. I'm sure it shocked a lot of people, but I think it really shocked herself that she asked him this question. She said, "What do you think about your books being banned from our library?" And he had a really good comeback to it. Anyway, it was really interesting. If you didn't read it, go back and read it again. Or if you forgot, go back and listen to it. It was a really good chapter. So we're going to go on and read the next couple of chapters today. The first one's really short, and then the second one's a little bit longer. So stay tuned, and we'll start that right now. A Present. The Adventures of Captain Underpants never made it to the banned books locker library. It was checked out before I even got back to class, and it stayed checked out, with a waiting list. I was going to have to save up and buy the rest of them now. I might even have to read it myself. That afternoon, from my spot in the corner of the library, I watched as Mrs. Jones thanked Mr. Pilkey and helped him get ready to go. He told her he'd had a great time and thanked her for fighting the good fight. He spotted me watching from the corner, and I ducked back behind the Lennon Eye Mystery. When I peeked out again, he had pulled something out of his bag and was whispering something to Mrs. Jones. She looked back at me with a curious expression on her face. Mr. Pilkey's ride to the airport arrived, and he and Mrs. Jones shook hands and said goodbye. When he was gone, Mrs. Jones called me up to the front desk. "Mr. Pilkey was very impressed with you, Amy Ann," Mrs. Jones told me. She had that same curious expression on her face, like she was trying to figure something out. "In fact, he left you a present." "Present?" Mrs. Jones looked around the same way I had in the cafeteria to make sure no one was watching, and then brought a boxed set of books up from beneath her desk. It was every single Captain Underpants book there was. 12 books. "For me?" I said. Mrs. Jones watched me closely. "He said you'd know what to do with them." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This was the biggest single donation in the history of the banned books locker library. "I do," I said, and I scooped them up. "Amy Ann," Mrs. Jones said, "you know not to show these around at school, right?" I nodded, already thinking about how to get in touch with MJ as soon as possible. We were going to need a lot more fake covers. The ayes have it. The very next day, Mrs. Spencer and her friends went through the stacks, looking at every single book. Mrs. Jones stood a few feet from them, watching them with her arms crossed on her big blue polka-dotted dress as they flipped through books, looking for anything they didn't like. But there was nothing she could do. Behind them on a table was a tower of books, removed for further review. I guess Mrs. Spencer didn't like Mrs. Jones' author visit stunt very much. That afternoon, I called an emergency meeting of the BBLL board during language arts. Rebecca and Danny and I got library passes and sat at one of the study tables. All around us, the shelves had big holes in them, where Mrs. Spencer and her friends had taken books away. "We have to do something," I said. What? Rebecca said. We have to get copies of all of the books they're taking off the shelves, Danny said. Where would we put all of them? This is way more than would fit in Amy Ann's locker, Rebecca said. My locker? Danny said. Your locker? We can find room. But we don't have enough money to buy them all, and we never will, Rebecca said. Not even if we had a bake sale every day. Unless Amy Ann can get every author to donate copies like Dave Pilkey. I sucked on a braid, thinking, there has to be another way, I said. What about it? Rebecca asked Danny. You're head of acquisitions. Danny combed his hair with his fingers. Well, I actually do have an idea. I know where we can get a copy of every single book taken off the shelves. For free, even. Where? Danny nodded at the big glass windows that separated Mrs. Jones' office from the rest of the library. I frowned until I saw what he was talking about. The shelf in the back corner of the office where Mrs. Jones kept all the books she'd pulled off the shelves. Rebecca gasped. You mean steal them? It's not stealing, Danny said. They're library books. The whole reason they're here in the first place is to loan out to kids. So we're just borrowing them, right? I felt slightly sick at the thought of sneaking into Mrs. Jones' office and taking something, even if it would mean we had every book Mrs. Spencer banned. Danny could see we weren't convinced. Look, Mrs. Jones bought those books so any kid could read them. That's what we're going to do with them. Let any kid read them. She would want us to. So why don't we just ask her for them? Rebecca said. Because she can't give them to us, I said. Not without losing her job. The school board told her not to, and she has to do what the school board says. I stared at the books. We can't take all of them, or Mrs. Jones would notice, Danny said. We don't need all of them, I said. We already have half of them. I can't believe we're even considering this, Rebecca said. Forget suing us. Theft is a misdemeanor. Does that mean we could go to jail? I asked. Well, no, not for stealing a few books. Restitution and community service, maybe. What's restitution? Danny asked. We have to return the books or pay for them, Rebecca explained. And it would very likely go down on our permanent record, which could mean we don't get into college. Danny flicked his hair back. I'm okay with all that. Danny, Rebecca said. I chewed on my braid. Stealing was bad. I knew that. I hadn't stolen a thing since that lollipop when I was little. But banning books was worse. I make a motion to borrow the books we don't already have in the BBLL from Mrs. Jones' office, I said. Second, Danny said. All those in favor? I asked. Aye, Danny said, pulling an eyelid down with a finger. I looked at Rebecca. You don't need my yes, she said. You've already got enough votes. You don't have to help if you don't want to, I told her. Rebecca sighed. Well, if we get in trouble, I do know a good lawyer. Aye. The ayes have it, Danny said, standing. Let's do this. What now? Rebecca said. Sure, he said. What are we waiting for? Helen to come? Wait, I said. First of all, Mrs. Jones is at the front desk. So we'll distract her, Danny said. And, I said, there's an alarm that goes off if you try to take a book out without checking it out. Remember? Oh, Danny said. How do we get around that? Chuck 'em over it? I doubted that would work, and I could just see myself trying to catch books out in the hall as Danny tossed them over the scanners. If it was anything like trying to catch a football in gym class, there would be busted books all over the floor. The only way we were going to be able to get away with it was to run the books over that machine at the front desk that demagnetized them, or whatever it did. For some weird reason, that made me think of the picture Trey had drawn for the right to assemble, with a person holding a sign up that said, Magnets, how do they work? We'll use the thing on the desk, I told them. The thing Mrs. Jones runs books over so the alarm doesn't go off, but that means we need a long distraction. I got this, Danny said. He pulled a book off one of the shelves around us, opened his messy backpack, and buried it as far down inside as he could go. What are you going to do? Rebecca said. He lifted his backpack onto his shoulder and headed for the door. I'm going to set off the alarm. Rebecca and I hurried around the aisle to where we could watch the entrance and the front desk. My heart was in my throat. I couldn't believe I was about to do this. What kind of person had I become that I would ask an author during a school visit what he thought about his books being banned? Who would steal books from the library to loan them out on my own secret locker library? Danny stepped between the two white plastic pedestals at the door and the alarm went off. Wonk, 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 wonk. Even though it wasn't very loud, the sound of it and the flashing red lights made me and Rebecca both jump. Danny jumped too, even though he'd been expecting it. Mrs. Jones stirred from her seat at the front desk. Danny, do you have a book in your backpack you haven't checked out? Danny flicked his hair out of his eyes. Geez, I don't think so, Mrs. Jones, he said. He tried to go back through, but the alarm went off again. Mrs. Jones came out from behind her desk and went to him. Here, let's take a look. Danny's eyes flicked to mine. It was now or never. I motioned for Rebecca to wait for me and hurried behind Mrs. Jones' desk. I was the one who knew what books we needed, and she could holler if Mrs. Jones was coming back. I ran to the shelf at the back, my whole body shaking. I skimmed the titles on the spines once all the way through before realizing that I hadn't really read a single word. I was freaking out. I needed to calm down. Think, reread the titles. I frowned. Not all of these were on the banned book list. Then I saw the label on the shelf, remove or replace. Some of the books were just old and worn out. Mrs. Jones was going to order new copies. That would help disguise the fact that I'd taken a few. I glanced over my shoulder. Rebecca glanced at Danny, who I couldn't see, and back to me. Her eyes told me to hurry, but not run. Are you there, God? It's me, Margaret. Matilda. Love you bunches. The Midwife's Apprentice. Harriet the Spy. The Great Brain. More Adventures of the Great Brain. And Tango Makes Three. The Diary of a Young Girl. The Giver. In the Night Kitchen. Coraline. The Golden Compass. The Face on the Milk Carton. A Day No Pigs Would Die. I went through the list in my head, ticking off all the books that didn't already have little green marks on the sheet behind the Go Eagles #1 sign on my locker. When I was finished, I had a stack that reached up to my chin. I hurried back out to the front desk with them. I was shaking so bad, I was sure I was going to trip and spill all the books. I made it to the front desk just as the books were tipping over, but Rebecca helped me catch them. I glanced over at the entrance. Danny was there on the floor, pulling things out of his backpack one at a time for Mrs. Jones. There's that language arts assignment, he said. I meant to turn that in, and hey, I've been looking for this hairbrush forever. Hurry, Rebecca whispered. I took the first book to the demagnetizer thing. I didn't really know how the thing worked. Did you have to push a button or something? I didn't see any buttons on it. Instead, I just did what Mrs. Jones always does. I stuck the spine of the book into the corner of it and moved it around. The machine made a little bonk, and a light lit up green. Success! I let out a big breath I hadn't realized I'd even been holding. I shoved the book at Rebecca, glanced over at Danny. He pulled a plastic food container out of his backpack. Oh man, what's growing in that? He said. I hurried and rubbed more books over the machine. My backpack's full, Rebecca said when I'd gotten about halfway through. Go, go, I told her, and she jog-walked through the door. I took a second to watch her go, half afraid Mrs. Jones would somehow physically know she had the banned books in her bag, and half afraid I hadn't demagnetized them the right way. Rebecca probably had the exact same fears, because she slowed down when she got to Danny and Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones had lost her patience with Danny and was looking in his backpack for him. Rebecca shot me a last look and skipped through the alarms. It didn't go off. Rebecca was out. Here we are, Mrs. Jones said, pulling a book from Danny's backpack. Big Wig, A Little History of Hair, Mrs. Jones read. What? Danny said. He flicked his hair out of his eyes so he could read it. Oh, yeah, it's, for a project I'm doing, about hair. Well, you'll need to check it out if you want to take it from the library, Mrs. Jones said. Danny looked my way in panic. I still had a small stack of books to demagnetize. I took a handful of them and stuck them in the machine all at once. The light lit up green. I took the other handful of them and did the same thing. Green. I would just have to hope it took care of all of them. I piled the books in my arms and scurried out from behind the desk, just as Mrs. Jones and Danny came over. She hadn't seen me. Now, to just stuff these in my backpack But my backpack was already full. It was filled to the top with all the textbooks that wouldn't fit in my locker. What was I going to do? I looked at the clock. I had to get back to class. Danny was already gone from the front desk. With no other choice, I slipped on my backpack, turned the books around so the titles all faced me, and headed for the exit. Just a few more steps, and then I remembered that I had demagnetized the books in handfuls. Were they all clean, or would one of them give me away? I held my breath again and stepped between the sensors. Nothing. I was free. "Amy Ann," Miss Jones called. I froze. She knew I'd heard her. I couldn't pretend I couldn't. I turned. "No goodbye?" Mrs. Jones said with a smile. I let out a sound that was something between "oh" and a frog croaking, then managed a wimpy little "goodbye" before hurrying away.